As the United States celebrates the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, groups across the nation are planning various commemorations. The website for America 250, the official bipartisan organization coordinating the nationwide efforts, asserts that the journey toward this historic milestone is an opportunity to pause and reflect on our nation's past, honor the contributions of all Americans, and look ahead toward the future we want to create for the next generation and beyond.
These celebrations come at a time when our national identity is fragmented and our sense of patriotism at an all-time low. An article from Newsweek states that surveys from PRRI, Pew Research Center, Gallup, NBC News, and Morning Consult point in the same direction. National pride is slipping, pessimism is rising.
Generational and partisan divides play a role here. Polls indicate that younger Americans are less likely to engage in traditional expressions of patriotism, or to describe themselves as patriotic. And Republicans are more likely than Democrats to say that they are proud to be an American.
The discussion around patriotism gets even more complicated when you take into account how stories about what it means to be American have gotten tied up with ideas about being a Christian nation or being uniquely chosen by God. For example, one PRRI poll found that 44% of people think God has granted the United States a special role in human history. But is that what the church teaches? What does the church actually say about patriotism and love of country? That's what we're going to talk about on the Glad You Asked podcast today.
Welcome to Glad You Asked, where we answer the questions about Catholicism that are easy to ask, but not so easy to answer.
Emily, it's great to talk to you for the podcast, although I just saw you 3 days ago at the Catholic Media Association conference.
Yeah, Rebecca and I got to be in person together for one of our one time a year we get to see each other. And at the award ceremony on Friday night, we were honored enough to take home several awards, including for this podcast.
Yes, you all are listening to the best social justice podcast in the United States. So there's something to feel patriotic about.
Well, the Catholic one at least. But yes. So thank you, first of all, just a thank you to everyone who listens. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for your support. And if you have any topics you ever want us to cover, let us know.
But today's topic is appropriate to the season, patriotism. How does a Christian approach patriotism? Should Christians be patriotic?
So my personal story that connects to this is I grew up, I was in high school during the war in Afghanistan. I was in middle school when 9/11 happened. Right. So I grew up at this time when I think kind of the overall national mood was a lot like we are now, maybe. And I went through this really rebellious phase. I did not stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I remember the 4th of July, or I probably, maybe it was Memorial Day, I don't know, one of these holidays. My church sang, I don't remember, America the Beautiful. I know there's several songs in the hymnal. And I just sat there. I didn't even stand. But I think, even in the Catholic Church, which for many years was criticized for not being patriotic enough, right? Like there was this thought that Catholics would never be truly loyal to the United States because their first loyalties would be to Rome. There is this complicated narrative about how your faith and your feelings about country kind of all tie together.
So yeah, it seems as though we have these two different narratives about what our country is, and there are times when it seems as though we're headed in a bad direction, and there's times when it seems as though we're headed in a good direction. And through both of these times, if a person is a person of faith who has a sense of, your first duty is to God, your first duty is to truth and goodness, there can be a lot of tension there, trying to figure out, do you pledge allegiance to a flag when you're supposed to be pledging allegiance to God or to caring for God's people? All of these get mixed up, and it can become a little bit more complicated when one is younger and wants to perhaps be a little bit rebellious.
I also think it gets more complicated when you think the country is going in a good direction. Right? It's easy to separate what your faith tells you from your national identity when you don't agree with the what your country is doing. But if you think both are making good or kind of going together, I think that that identity starts to get a little more complicated and mixed up, and it's harder to tease those one from the other and figure out, what do I owe to God? What do I owe to my country? And maybe that's one of the things we're going to start to tease out today. I'm Emily Santa, one of the hosts of Glad You Asked.
And I'm Rebecca Bratton Weiss. Before we get into the interview, let's take a moment to thank our sponsors.
Glad You Asked is sponsored by the Claretian Missionaries. The USA-Canada province of the Claretian Missionaries tends to the religious and pastoral needs of vulnerable communities. As part of a global congregation of Catholic priests and brothers, Claretians uplift the dignity of all people, especially those who feel overlooked or forgotten. To find out more and get involved, please visit www.claretians.org.
Now, back to today's question. Is patriotism a Christian virtue?
To answer this question, we talked to religion scholar and public intellectual Dr. Lewis Brogdon. Brogdon was recently appointed executive director of Just Faith Ministries, a nonprofit that creates programs for the advancement of peace, racial equity, and a sustainable world. He has served in numerous leadership and teaching roles in academic institutions, including Simmons College of Kentucky, Claflin University, Bluefield University, Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and the Baptist Seminary of Kentucky.
He is a regular contributor to several publications, including Christian Ethics Today and Black Politics Today. He is the author of several books, including Hope on the Brink, The Emergence of Nihilism in Black America. He has written and spoken on an array of issues related to public life, including the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., reparations for African Americans, slavery in the Bible, and the enduring legacy of racism in the United States.
Lewis, thanks so much for being our guest on the podcast today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for the invitation.
We should probably start by clarifying for our listeners what patriotism is and what makes it different from nationalism.
Well, let's start with when I was in high school and college, we used to have this thing, and I know some of my listeners aren't going to know what I'm talking about, a Merriam-Webster dictionary. So I want to pull out a sort of old school dictionary definition. Patriotism is love for or devotion to one's country. Whereas a sort of dictionary definition of nationalism is loyalty and devotion to a nation, especially a sense of national consciousness, exalting one nation above all others, sort of placing, your nation in a primary position. So it's helpful to just start that at the very basic level. Patriotism is, loving your country, being devoted to your country, the good of your country. Nationalism is where it can get a little bit more complicated. So patriotism is something that can be a virtue when it's guided by, love, truth, and justice and accountability. But when it becomes nationalism, when it gets mixed in there with a kind of love for your country that replaces God or makes God secondary, that when your nation is above criticism, that's when nationalism can complicate our understanding and our practice of patriotism. So it's such an important topic, given the historical moment in which we find ourselves. And I think it's appropriate for Christians to be patriots, to show patriotism. What we have to be a little careful with is nationalism, particularly the kinds where you have groups that are saying we're special, our country is special in a hierarchical sense, that we're more important than others. Our rights should be protected and not others. God bless this country and not necessarily blessing all the countries of the world. which is why there's so much talk in our public discourse around what happens with, with Christian nationalism, because you get a big problem in the country when people don't know where one ends and the other begins, when patriotism sort of bleeds into nationalism, which is why I just think it's such an important conversation to be having in 2026.
Yeah, so you just said that patriotism can kind of sneakily bleed into nationalism. So, what then does healthy patriotism look like specifically for Christians? What does the church teach about our obligations to our political life, to governments and laws?
Well, when it comes to the relationship that Christians have with the state, Christians have struggled with this question going back to the days of the early church and the complex relationship the first Christians had with the Roman Empire. I mean, if you think about it, how does a small movement with an antagonistic relationship to the most powerful empire in the ancient world, in a matter of decades, it becomes, in probably centuries, it becomes the accepted religion of the empire? It's interesting what happens in the first decades and centuries of early Christian history, because initially the Christian confession, Jesus is Lord, is a political statement, because it's contradicting the widespread worship and belief that Caesar is Lord, that the Roman Empire is absolute and is supreme. So what ends up happening, and of course you'd have to do a lot of reading in Christian history to wrap your heads around it, is that you're going to have accommodations and adjustments on both sides. You're going to have early Christian communities move from being persecuted. They're in the arenas. They're burning at the stake, the lions, the whole to all of a sudden, you're going to have Christian leaders convincing the empire that this movement is not a threat, that Christians can be good citizens, even patriots under certain conditions. Let me just give you a few. So, for example, they'll say, look, Christians can be great citizens as long as there's some respect that, in our belief, in the supremacy of God or the lordship of Jesus Christ. If the government's fine with us saying God is first, we can have a wonderful relationship. Another example would be they'll say, well, Christians actually encourage people to be obedient to just laws and legal systems. They understand they're never going to be perfect. But Christian leaders will say, hey, we are law-abiding citizens. We believe in respecting the laws of the land. And that's one of the conditions that allows Christians to be good citizens. And I think it's related to patriotism, and I'll get to that in a second. And then you often see in New Testament letters where the apostles start making these early allusions to Christians praying for government leaders and officials. So you see this idea of praying for and working for the good of the world. That some of what it is that Christians are doing is not just about heaven, but it's about our lives together here on earth. But there are two big problems with that, okay? And the first big problem is that religion is too powerful a tool for empires to just leave alone. Okay, so if it would be great if you would have these powerful empires who say, okay, we'll respect your religion and we won't infringe on it. We'll kind of leave you all alone to practice your religion. But these powerful empires understand, wait a minute, religion can be a very, very helpful tool for us in advancing our social, political, and economic agenda. So that's what's going to complicate Christians' relationship with the state, both historically as well as today. And also you have Christians, they're enmeshed in culture. Okay, so, we're part of these nations and empires Christian leaders will take on powerful positions in these empires. And so it gets exceedingly difficult to, to sort of do this sort of common thing you hear people talk about. How are we to be in the world, but not of the world? That's easier said than done. So healthy patriotism tries to keep God first, but that is not as easy as you think. All right, so I just want to start by saying, when we think about healthy patriotism, it's really trying to say, hey, let's have God first. I would encourage you to check out a book called Honest Patriots by Donald Shriver. It's Honest Patriots. The subtitle is Loving a Country Enough to Remember Its Misdeeds. And he quotes William Sloane Coffin at the beginning of the book that says there are three kinds of patriots, two bad, one good. The bad are the uncritical lovers and loveless critics. Good patriots carry on a lover's quarrel with their country, a reflection of God's lover's quarrel with all of the world. So then that adds a sort of second dimension to healthy patriotism, which is nations should be accountable to God. And this is just to get us started because we don't have enough time. I would need a 10-hour podcast to kind of dig into all of this. But let's just start by saying healthy patriotism from an aspirational standpoint, we're trying to say it's God first, even God over all the nations of the world. And it's also understanding all the nations are accountable to God, because usually what happens with nationalism is that gets muddied. Okay. And that's when it becomes hard to find out, wait a minute, where is one ending and the other is beginning? I'm gonna dig even more into this, but let's come up for air.
Yeah, so I'm really fascinated by your statement that that early statement, Jesus is Lord, is a political one. And I think this brings up another question, which is, in the United States, we tend to think of our faith as a private matter. And we also recognize a valid separation of church and state. So if Christian faith obliges us to engage in public affairs, how do we square this with that separation on a political side, on the side of our Constitution?
Well, it's a great question, and I always teach my students in my Black and Womanist theology courses that you always want your theology to have tension and growing edges. You never want a sort of neat and tidy theology that doesn't leave you with a little uneasiness, because we're trying to wrap our small finite minds around complex and vast issues, and so I teach them that you want to try to hold a balance. And so I think this question gets at the need for balance, because you do want the separation of church and state, because you don't want the state legislating religion. That there's just lots of problems with that. In a country that is trying to be a democracy, which is respecting all the peoples, you don't need a government making the choice of religion for people. So it's a deeply held belief. It is very, very important, especially even though I grew up Pentecostal, I'm now, an ordained Baptist minister. And for Baptists, that's like, man, one of their big things. Like, they want to die on the separation of church and state hill. But as a Black person, as a Black Christian, we also understand that sometimes the state can get off, can be doing things that are affecting all of God's people. And so that does then concern the church. And so you want to yes, while hold to the importance that we need that important separation between the church and the state, we also want to give space for and lift up the important role that the church plays in, to use the language of Dr. King in his famous sermon, A Knock at Midnight. He says, the church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. And when we understand that, then if the government is doing things that are having a negative effect on the lives of God's people, we have a responsibility to speak up. This is why the prophetic tradition, which is rooted, yes, lots of talk about the prophetic in the New Testament, but it really goes back to the Old Testament and the whole emergence of prophets and the prophetic. And the prophets were the check on the institutions in ancient Israel. The prophets kept the monarchy in check and the temple. Because what happens with institutions is that sometimes they get off track. And the prophetic mechanism, and I think that's the same thing that religion has, that same mechanism in any country, is to always sort of be that prophetic check to make sure, not in a sense where we are legislating our religion, but it's this idea of the common good, which my Catholic sisters and brothers, do so much important work in that area, especially with Catholic social teaching, that we are called in a tangible way to build a world where all of God's people can thrive. And so the church has a prophetic and a public facing role to attend to that important work. So, but holding that balance is not easy.
But you've written in the past about the struggle for the soul of America. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that and kind of apply what we've all just been talking about the call for Christians to hold their government up to a high standard, right? How does that kind of apply to what's going on today in today's politics?
Wonderful question. When people are having conversations about what is happening in America, especially when you look at the partisan divide and just how dysfunctional our political system is, political discourse in this country, when you see the allocation of resources in this country, who's getting what. I mean, I just come back from Washington, D.C. I was at a conference with a group called Bread for the World, and we're on Capitol Hill because HR 1 is going to be cutting $900 billion to $1 trillion for Medicaid, $186 billion in cuts to SNAP. And these things are going to have a devastating effect. And we're already seeing millions of families who have already been kicked off SNAP. That these aren't just political issues, social issues, but really they're symptomatic of a deeper moral and spiritual crisis that we are facing in this country. That you don't get a country with the kind of history that we have here in the U.S. without having these sort of crossroads moments where the country has to face a decision about what path are we going to take. And we can look back historically and see, and I'm very, very grateful for a movement like the abolitionist movement, where folks fought to end that system of African enslavement in America. It wasn't just all the speeches being given, the Civil War, new laws being passed. It was a moral movement that they were challenging the moral structure of society. King and so many others in the 50s and 60s did it with the civil rights movement. And I think in a real way, we're in a similar moment, that we're in a fight for the soul of this country, that we are facing a moral crisis. And I wrote the op-ed, and it was published in the Courier Journal and got picked up in newspapers all across the country. It was interesting when you got folks on both sides of the aisle who were reaching out to the seminary I was teaching at that it really spoke to him. One email came from the Secretary of State for the state of Kentucky, who was a Republican, but it really spoke that they see it. And I'm not the only person that's speaking in these terms. That Joe Biden, that was a big part of his platform when he ran for office. That what happened in Charlottesville, it was very, very tragic, but it was symptomatic of this deeper fight. I think what was really tragic is that once he was elected, he didn't use his platform to continue the important work that America needs, because we're still in this fight for our soul. And look what has played out in this country since, Trump's second election. So a couple of things I talked about in that piece is hatred is at the center of the crisis that we are facing, that we have this problem with othering, and othering is very, very complex. That once one group categorizes another group as other, in whatever language they want to use, then those people start to be, they embody evil, that they're dehumanized. It gives people license to discriminate against these people, to disenfranchise these folks, and then to participate in acts of violence. And this crisis is not just, it's those folks over there. It's really happening on both sides of the spectrum, that you're seeing folks talking about the rise of extremism in this country, just this wave of hatred and chaos. So the article, The Fight for the Soul of America, began this protracted conversation that I've been having with leaders, communities for quite some time about this crisis, that I followed up with some other pieces that deepens the nature of the challenge in which we are facing. And so King is someone who is an important conversation partner for me, because, King did this same work in the 50s and 60s, challenging the soul of this country to take the better path. His final book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? We've gotten the decision that America made in the late 60s. They're like, we're going to choose the path to chaos. And that's what we are dealing with. And so in my work, I try to help people to understand how we got to this moment. And then what does it mean to have community in this moment, to do the work of justice in this moment, to reclaim the moral and prophetic witness of the church in this moment, in a way that sets us on a different path.
So many Christians today feel politically homeless because of this scenario you've just described. Some are uncomfortable with both major parties and don't feel like they have a place in them. Or on the other hand, there might be the case of engagement in public life bringing one to a point where partisan identity can eclipse baptismal identity. How can Christians remain engaged in public life without this happening?
I would like to start with the part of the question that says many Christians today feel politically homeless, and that is so true. That some of what we describe as partisanism in the U.S. is really, it's tribalism. One of my most vivid memories from Obama's first administration was, one time he was in a press conference, and there was a ton of Republicans there, and, their whole approach to him was obstruction. Okay, they're going to oppose everything that he tries to propose. And he systematically went through and showed how many of his recommendations actually came from Republicans. And it was beside the point. The point was that, okay, he's making the point, so we can't agree. And that's what turns so many people off, that sometimes the fighting really isn't about the issue. It's about, we're on this team, you're on that team, to use a sports metaphor, because I have have a sports background, if we find out, oh, well, I'm a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. If you like the Dallas Cowboys, there's just a way we start, well, and there are people of goodwill, but many Christians who see some of the dysfunctional ways partisanism is playing out, and they feel disenfranchised. And we see it when you look at participation in electoral processes, like we're in the 20s among advanced democracies. When, you would think we would have one of the, high levels of electoral participation. And so what I do want to say to people who are listening is that I understand is that, we're facing this issue in the African American community that has deep, deep ties with the Democratic Party, but we're starting to see those numbers hemorrhaging. And you're starting to see some Black folks voting Republican, and like there are people in the Black communities like, what is going on? But you're also seeing some Black people who are just not voting, okay, because they're just like, it's all bad. None of it makes any kind of difference. So I like to start by saying, let's try to separate the political from the partisan. Okay, I'm not going to try to rehabilitate what we see happening with partisan politics, but I do want people to understand we have important work to do in the political space, and it does go back to this idea about the common good. I heard sometimes African American preachers who don't want to get involved in political issues. They're like, it's my call to preach the gospel. And then my retort is, well, what would that theology have done while we were enslaved? So for the centuries Black people were enslaved in America, trying to say you are espousing an approach to the gospel that will not address the elephant in the room, which is Black people are legally enslaved. What does God have to say about that? Well, that's political. And thanks be to God to folks who understood, wait a minute, as Christians, we do have a responsibility to weigh in on common good issues. People are being unfairly treated. They are sleeping under bridges. Okay, that's not a partisan issue, but that does speak to our life together. And we care about each other if we take the story of the Good Samaritans seriously, if we take Matthew 25 seriously. So while I do understand you can feel politically homeless, I want to say, look, I'm fine with your disgust with what's happening with partisan politics. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's understand, oh, wait a minute, the church, we do have a responsibility to society, to the way we allocate resources and organize ourselves and how we treat each other. That when Jesus came and taught about the kingdom of God, that is a guiding vision for the church about the kind of world God wants us to build. And what does it say in the model prayer? Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. If you're in a society where people don't have their basic needs, then that has implications for what it is that we're not just supposed to pray for, but what we are to be working towards. So I understand the level of discomfort with what's happening with these parties. And this is why I so appreciate the prophetic witness, the moral clarity and courage of Pope Leo, the ways in which he is one shining example of many Christians and people of faith who are standing up to reclaim the Christian witness and the Christian tradition from its grotesque distortions in our national life. And I want to issue an invitation to hearers, be a part of that, of bringing a level of engagement to our public life that reflects our Christian commitments, our baptismal identity, not the distortions we're seeing that's turning people off. And I think that's a healthy and a helpful way to begin doing some of that work.
Yeah, so to go off of that a little bit, I think you're so right that part of the reason why people feel disenfranchised right now is because of the partisanship and this deep divide between people. But there's so much else going on too, right? There's the sheer overwhelm, how bombarded we are all the time with injustice and tragedy and like problems. It seems like there's no way to fix. What role specifically do faith communities play in helping people kind of move through this anger and grief and this feeling of like, I can't do anything, it's bigger than me, into collective action?
Great question. Let me do 3 things with the response. The first is I want to point to some places in Scripture that I believe are sources of guidance, inspiration, and strength. First place is Genesis chapter 1. And you will notice in the second verse, it paints this picture of darkness and chaos with the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the deep. Verses 3 through 31, you see God bringing order out of the chaos. And what I want you to pay attention. So, the professor's going to give you some homework. So your homework's going to be, you're going to read Genesis chapter 1. And here's what you're going to notice. You're going to notice after each day, God stops and recognizes what has been done and recognizes that it's good. Now, even though after the first day, there's still 5 more days of work to do before you even get to the 7th day, God stops to observe. And I think that is teaching us something, that after each day, there is stopping to recognize the good that has been done. And then after the 6th day, there is the looking at the totality of good that has been done and the declaration of seeing that it is very good. So good can happen even though there's still more to do. That good can happen even though bad stuff is still happening. We have to learn how to identify, name, and celebrate good that is happening. Second place in Scripture is Romans 12:21. It says, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That some of the overwhelm is by design. That we have an administration and there are people with their hands on the levers of society that want people overwhelmed to the extent that they disengage. Okay. So some of this is really, it's social engineering, which is why we have to dig deep. And do we have wells that are deep in the Christian tradition? Scripture says that we don't have to be overcome by this, that we have something that allows us to overcome what it is that we're grappling with. And what is it? It is good. Which is what turns me to the third piece, which is Galatians 6:10, that says, don't be weary in well-doing, for we shall reap if we do not give up. We have to, notice you're hearing my language, we have to keep pushing. Which is why I want to give you a strategy that will help, I think, supplement the deep inspiration and guidance we get from these 3 places in Scripture. And the strategy comes in the form of Lewis Brogdon's math equation. And it's this: principal partnerships plus political power plus collective action equals increased impact. Okay, so, and I'm going to unpack this because folks feel like, we're not making a difference. There's just so much bad stuff happening. I don't even know where to begin. I'm going to tell you where you begin. Partnerships. Don't be trying to do this work by yourself. get connected to organizations and people that's doing something. And you will notice that I describe those partnerships. They need to be principled. Okay, you're going to have strategic choices to make in the coming days, weeks, and months to not align yourself with organizations and mechanisms that aren't about the work. They may be important to your family, important to your people, but if they aren't about this work God is calling you to, then it's not benefiting you. So you need principled partnerships, because when we come together, we have this thing called political power, not partisan power. We have political power. So over 400 people were in DC with Bread for the World, and we descended on the Capitol to sit in the office of our representatives and to respectfully have conversations about what is happening with these bills, their implications for people in our communities that are going hungry. If you do that by yourself, you can be dismissed. But when you come together as a group, then it's hard to dismiss. So then when you act together, you have greater impact. And then I'll leave you with the third thing, is a resource I wrote. It's an op-ed on Baptist News Global called "Can Justice Movements Lose Their Soul?" And that's going to give you a different layer on the overwhelm, is that sometimes people of faith get caught up in these broader forces swirling in the country and find themselves being reactive and complicit in the very things they claim to not stand for. And I think that's going to help you to dig into the important work that we have in the coming days.
Now, you've recently become executive director of Just Faith Ministries. How does that work connect to the themes that you've been exploring in your writing and what you've been talking about to us today about patriotism, justice, and public life?
I often tell people I just started in January, and my first big trip as executive director was, in second week of May, when I got to go out to Los Angeles and Oakland. So I'm working on my elevator speech as the new executive director. And one of the things I like to tell people is that Just Faith is really a partner for all the Good Samaritans in our community. Because, there are three people in the story. Two, they kind of see and they don't do anything. But the whole context of the story is someone asking Jesus, what does it mean to love God? And Jesus explains it by telling this story and lifts up the Samaritan. And so I really see what we do here at Just Faith Ministries is we're doing the work to help people to see, and to not just see, but to understand what it is that you are seeing, so that you can act in ways that really help. And we have all kinds of programs. We have a Faith in Poverty series. We've got standalone programs like The Land Is Not Our Own, Want to Talk, Faith in Immigration, Preventing Gun Violence, a great racial justice series. And then our newest program is Tend My Sheep, Addressing Poverty Through the Lens of Catholic Social Teaching. That just dropped today. Really, really excited to share that news. And I see the work that we do with these important programs, because we're celebrating our 25-year anniversary this fall with over 75,000 graduates, people who are doing incredible work. How does this intersect with some of the conversations that we have had today around, patriotism? Is that we try to form communities that are rooted in justice and discernment. That today, communities really need discernment to do this important work that we're called to do. We're in a moment of social conflict, polarization. How do you navigate that? How do you talk to people who are different? We have a program called Want to Talk that helps people to figure out how to have nonviolent conversations, how to develop those practices of civil dialogue. We also try to connect faith to concrete action. It's not just about learning for, to be inspired, like, oh, that was really interesting. But it's, what are you going to do with what you're learning? How do we go out and take up this work in a way that makes God's world a better place? And so what these programs are doing, it's providing that important formational work that helps you to make sense of the chaos, the conflict, the polarization in a way that doesn't leave you stuck, that provides a real opening to then step into that and be light and to lead. Teach, Dr. Brogdon. I'm doing the best I can. That's what I say when I'm preaching in the Black church.
Well, speaking of preaching, we always ask people at the very end of these conversations, what is one thing that you want our listeners to take away from this entire conversation?
That I think right now it's very, very important for Christians to be discerning and not reactionary. That the temptation is going to be to get caught up into everything that's swirling. But the gospel and the church and the Christian tradition, it provides resources for discernment. I mean, please read the Pope's new encyclical. I mean, that's like right up discernment alley. That we can either try to build this tower, okay, or we can build community. So, I mean, that just it's incredible. So we have resources that will help us to make sense of what's happening so that we're not stuck. So discernment.
Well, that's all of our questions for today. Thank you so much for talking to us for the podcast. This has been really great.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Emily, that was a wonderful conversation we just had, but was there anything that we discussed that Dr. Brogdon brought up that really stood out to you?
Okay, I really like the William Sloane Coffin quote he mentioned, that there are 3 kinds of patriots, 2 bad and 1 good. And the bad ones are the uncritical lovers and the loveless critics of a country, and that a good patriot will carry on a lover's quarrel with their country. I hadn't heard that quote before, but it reminded me so much of various interviews and conversations that I've had through my work here at US Catholic, that like people wouldn't be protesting, they wouldn't be trying to make things better if they didn't love the country. They would just leave. And I think that's such an important point, and I think it's such a important framing for why we sometimes are called to protest. And I honestly, I think that it speaks to other institutions as well, like maybe the Catholic Church, regardless of whether we name it that way at all. Anyway, I just really like that quote.
Yeah, that was really good. I don't know about you, but I sometimes am sitting here wondering, why do people have such a sense that we're supposed to have uncritical devotion to our country? And I don't know whether it's an upbringing issue or an education issue, or simply that some people have kind of really made a choice to identify really hard as Americans, kind of to the neglect of everything else. But at the same time, it might be that, you and I work for a Catholic social justice magazine. We were brought up with various understandings of an obligation to push back against one's country, perhaps. And maybe not everyone else has had that experience.
I also don't think that that's new, right? Like so many of our forebears, our ancestors who came to this country, I mentioned it in the introduction, right? They were looked on with suspicion because they weren't American enough. Their allegiance was to Rome. And so I do think, especially among Catholics, there's some baggage there, right? Of how can we be seen as truly American? How can we also kind of bring like an immigrant's, many of us, like an immigrant's optimism about the country, right? Like this was the place where our grandparents and our great grandparents came to have a better life. And I think that is also like a really important part of our story as American Catholics for a lot of, especially like white Catholics. Certainly not everyone, but that narrative is so mixed up in the story of American Catholicism. And I'm willing to like honor that, right? Like my grandparents came here from Italy and North Africa. Like they were blue collar workers. My grandpa worked as a steel worker. My grandma took in sewing, and they came to this country like bought a summer home on Long Island, right? Like they made it, sent 3 kids through Catholic school in New York City. They are kind of like the American dream, and that to them was so tied up in their faith. And so like no wonder so many of us have gotten that. Like that's part of, as much as I, criticize some of what our country does, that also is part of my story too.
So something that I feel like I need to kind of sit with for a while is this idea that being too critical can be a problem, and that perhaps the way in which we push back against unjust things that our nation does, if that pushback isn't driven by love, could end up not being helpful, not moving in the right direction. Little reminder to myself sometimes.
I do like that idea of a pushback framed by love, or however it is you just said.
Something that came up, something that just kind of struck me was this idea of how subversive it was for the early Christians to say Jesus is Lord. Jesus is Lord is so much a part of Christian discourse especially in a lot of evangelical circles. And we've come to associate it with a form of Christianity that sometimes has an unquestioning, not only patriotism, but nationalism. And Jesus is Lord, I wish we could just reclaim how radical that is, but also connect it to, if Jesus is Lord, that isn't licensed to just check out and say, well, I don't care about what happens here. Because if we're building the kingdom of God, we have an obligation to one another, to our communities, and that translates into our community that is our entire nation. Was there anything that you wanted to ask for more information about?
Yeah, I think so. We talked about the prophets, right? And the prophet's role as kind of this check on the institution, whether the monarchy in ancient Israel, the religious institution. And I kept thinking about what prophetic witness looks like when we're inside the institution, because the prophets really were on the outside. They were like extremely countercultural to some extent, whatever that meant for whatever prophet, right? So when we're talking about being like a proud American or working for the government or working for media, for so many of us, like, how do we have that kind of lover's quarrel from our positions on the inside where we can't be Ezekiel and like go live in the wilderness and have visions? Right? That's not an option.
Are you sure? Because I kind of want to do that.
Your family might object to that. Yeah, I just wish we'd taken some of that like beautiful, language he had about the prophets and then kind of applied it to where we all are in our real world.
I kind of felt the same, not quite in those terms, but I really wanted to discuss in more detail what it really looks like to take this kind of a prophetic stance. And the reason why I'm inclined towards this is because, once again, I think that it's easy to fall back on either, well, I'm a patriot, I support everything my country does, yay, USA, or, wow, the United States has really not lived up to its claims about itself, and so I'm just going to reject all gestures of patriotism. It's a lot harder to engage with a complicated history and to do so with the principles of the gospel in mind, where you can say, well, here we did the right thing, here we did the wrong thing. What can we do to make sure that we do the right thing in the future? And how can we hold ourselves accountable for the times we were complicit in the wrong thing in the past? It just gets a lot harder.
You know who's doing it well? The Obamas. I don't know if you've seen the coverage of the new Obama Presidential Library that's opened up in the south side of Chicago, right? It just opened up. And it, of course, like the timing is intentional around the 250th anniversary. But it's a public library location, so you need tickets to get into the museum, which are booked out like 4 or 5 months already. But anyone can go to the library. Anyone can go to the playground and the grounds and the space. It's a public space. And it's, to me, I was thinking about how I was listening to parts of Michelle Obama's speech at the opening, and she's not making any pretense that there's some stuff going on in the country that she's struggling with. But like this commitment to community, this commitment to like raising up those who don't have access to things and bringing people together, I just think like that's our country done well, right? And I don't see that very many places.
I haven't seen it often, but I do think that there are places in our Christian history where we do get really powerful images of leadership where it's not a matter of, checking out and living in the wilderness and having visions. It's a matter of staying very present and maintaining a hope, even when everything looks hopeless. And I mean, some of the people who have had that witness died for it. So once again, it's not easy.
Well, I think that brings us to our last question, which is what sermon would you preach?
I think the sermon I would preach would be a reminder to people who do love our country because they are veterans, because patriotism is important to them, to encourage them, if they really do believe in both God and country, that God needs to come first. You can never put country before God. And you hear God and country a lot, and you see the flag next to the cross, and that becomes idolatry if we're not placing God's commands above whatever it is that the nation demands of us. What would your sermon be?
I just keep coming back to that. I mean, you brought it up, right? His commentary on Jesus is Lord. And I think we are often really uncomfortable with using metaphors of hierarchy. We're much more likely to say Jesus is, I don't know, a mother, right? Jesus is wind. I don't know, to use these other metaphors than to say Jesus is king, Jesus is Lord. And I think there's something worth reclaiming there, that when the early church said that Jesus is Lord, they were making this really radical, like anti-imperial statement at a time when the Roman Empire demanded like ultimate allegiance. And what might it look like to reclaim Jesus as Lord in a period where we are today, when the Christian nationalism is having more and more of a resurgence, and Jesus and national kingship is becoming kind of more and more entwined? Like, how can we kind of reclaim that original radicalness of the early Christians when they said that? I don't know that I know the answer to my sermon yet, but that's what I would want to figure out in the sermon.
I love this idea. It's another way of taking a common narrative and flipping it upside down. So I would enjoy your sermon for sure.
Well, that's our show. Thanks again for joining us. We're glad you asked. If you enjoyed the episode, please tell your friends about the podcast, or leave us a review or rating on whatever podcast platform you listen to. It helps more people find our podcast.
Do you have a question you'd like to hear answered on our show? Email us at editors@uscatholic.org. And please join us next week when we talk about whether the anointing of the sick really heals people.
Before we conclude this episode, we'd like to invite you to join us in prayer at the National Shrine of St. Jude, which was founded by our sponsors, the Claretian Missionaries, in 1929. As the patron saint of impossible causes, St. Jude offers hope to millions. Our National Shrine of St. Jude provides a peaceful place for renewal, belonging, and a deeper connection to God. Send in your prayer petitions today. We will place them on the altar of St. Jude to be held in prayer all year. Visit shrineofstjude.org today.
Glad You Asked is hosted by me, Rebecca Bratton-Weiss, along with Emily Santa. We are produced by Stephanie Clary, with sound engineering by Nathaniel Hunter and art by Megan Avery.